Okay. Well, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depend the place you are. My name is Florencia Médici, member of the Management Committee of the Association for Heterodox Economics. I'm happy to be here on behalf of the association to welcome the second 2022 webinar entitled Discussing Global Inflation. I am here with my colleague, Danielle Guizzo, who is also a member of the Management Committee of the association. Danielle will be our co-host this session. We want to especially thank Professors Kregel, Palumbo, and Pinkusfeld for accepting our invitation. It's an honor and a privilege to have this opportunity to think and discuss with you about such important subjects. As usual, first we'll have the exposition, and then we have some time for questions and answers. The question for the speaker will be collected on the chat. Well, please mute their microphones during the session. Well, before to start, let me inform you, we'll record this session. We are recording the session. Now, well, I introduced the speaker briefly. Dr. Antonella Palumbo is Associate Professor of Economics at Roma University. She received her PhD in Economics from Sapienza University in Rome. She has published many articles in journals and chapters in books and co-authored the third volume of Rough and the Reconstruction of Economic Theory. She has been visiting professors at Korea University, Seoul, Mexico, and in India. She is member of the board of directors of Piero Raffa Research Center and member of the executive committee of the Italian Association for the History Political Economy. She works on classical theory of value and distribution, on classical, Marxian, pre-classical, and neoclassical theories of value, on growth theory, on Phillips curve, and policies for full employment. Dr. Jan Kregel is Director of Research of the Levy Economics Institute, Director of the Levy Institute Master's Program in Economic Theory and Policy, and Head of the Institute's Monetary Policy and Financial Structure Program. In 2009, Kregel served as reporter of the President of the UN General Assembly's Commission of Reform of the International Financial System. He previously directed the Policy Analysis and Development Branch of the UN Financing of Development Office and was Deputy Secretary of the UN Committee of Experts on International Cooperation in Tax Matters. And well, he has published extensively papers and books. In 2011, Professor Kregel was elected to the Lycean Academics. He is fellow of the Royal Economic Society and elected member of the Italian Society of Economists. In 2010, he was awarded the Veblen Common Award for the Association for Revolutionary Economics. Last but not least important, Dr. Carlos Pinkusfeld. He holds a master's degree in economics of industry and technology from the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro and a PhD in economics from New School for Social Research. He is currently an associate professor at the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, and he works mainly on inflation, economic policy, functional finance, economic development, and public policy. So we'll start with our first speaker. Please, Professor Pinkusfeld, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'll upload my presentation here. Oops, got it. Share. Okay. It's okay? Okay, perfect. First of all, I'm honored to participate in this web seminar with such distinguished scholars as Professor Palumbo and Professor Kregel. I'd like also to thank Association for Heterodox Economics for the kind invitation. When I was thinking about my talk, I realized that the present is so unstable and the near future so unpredictable that occurred to me that it might be a good idea to talk about the past. So that's kind of strategy. So that's why I borrowed this phrase from Minsky, but I will use it in a different context. But don't worry, it isn't a totally historical account. I'll try to use this particular historical event, which is the inflation of the 70s, to discuss the current inflation problem. In fact, what I'll try to do, I'll try to understand how the orthodox consensus that emerged from the stagflation of the 70s could have important consequences for the future development of the world economy. So that the change that happened there is very important. I will use in the beginning as I'll call an exposition device, not my words, but the words of maybe the most important economist of the time, which is Friedman. So before I present the Friedman's interpretation, it's important to remember that inflation it's one of the most important elements to explain the end of the golden age. One might say that the state has learned the trick, or learned to manage demand, but capitalism was and still the same. Classes have opposing distributive interests. So this distributive conflicts are a constant feature of capitalist economy. And depending on the degree of this conflict, it will lead to a higher or lower inflation. So should keep it in mind because it could be brought back in the present days, but not clear. So another characteristic that is kind of we can remember, it can be used for what we are living today, that this already heated distributive conflicts was at the geopolitical and geoeconomic crisis in the late 60s and the 70s. The US unraveled the Bretton Woods system for reasons, nationalistic reasons. And there was a pre-existing movement of natural resources called the natural resources nationalism, increasing in commodities and increasing in oil prices. But then after the Yom Kippur War, there was the oil shock in 1973. So we have some similarities, or might have some similarities with the current situation. Okay, so now I turn to Friedman words. What I've tried to show here is that the real cause of inflation was monetary lax policy, basically this. Okay, but let's quote Friedman by himself. He speaks much better than me about what he thinks. First thing that is that since the Federal Reserve System began operating, which happened to coincide with the outbreak of the World War I, we have purely fiat or fiduciary currency that changed the monetary regime, facilitated inflation. So first thing that is basic, that the central bank had like wrong policies since the beginning of the century, but it got much worse after the Second World War. And the second thing that he says that the reinforcing factor was acceptance by the federal government of responsibility for full employment. So the persistent idea or political idea that the government has to provide or has to guarantee the full employment for workers was just a big mistake. And this was a second element that's crucial to explain inflation in the 70s. A third reason is, of course, that the United States and other countries had too rapid increase in the quantity of money consistent of mistakes made by central banks. Once again, that was a mistake made by central banks. The policy was wrong. And the central bankers of the world, they have been operating on the erroneous theories. So in the process of trying to hold down interest rates, they have produced inflation with the end results that interest rates went up for a higher level. So basically, the policy, the 20th century policy, and specifically after the Second World War, was wrong. And to control inflation was very easy, was just to change those policies. I would like to say also that was very important, everybody knows, but important to stress this point, because it will be important to discuss the current events, that the two ideas, the idea of full inertia and natural rate of unemployment, are central, crucial to Friedman's accelerationist Phillips curve. And this bunch of ideas, something monetary policy was wrong, there is a natural rate of unemployment, of course, is consistent with the marginalist market equilibrium, and the idea that the inertia is full embedded in the price making process. Now, there is the emergence of this new consensus that initially subscribed the monetarist interpretation that stagflation of the 70s was a result of policy mistakes. That's most important, policy mistakes, and therefore they emphasize the importance of strict inflation target. So after the 70s and mainly after 79, the 80s, there was this new consensus that the most important variable that government should deal with or attack is inflation. And this awful word, the credibility, that become a buzzword for several things and sometimes for nothing. But anyway, so the credibility is widely regarded, it's another quote, around the world as the key to effective monetary policy. So the spread of explicit or implicit inflation target has demonstrated its virtues. The new working consensus on monetary policy has helped to reduce the volatility of both inflation and output. So we have this new consensus that was adopted by 99.9% of countries, and that the target in inflation was the core of any economic policy, and to avoid inflation was basically what was needed, was just to be tough in terms of monetary policy. Okay, so we can summarize these comments that we have like a contradiction between those ideas and the previous idea that I mentioned, that the inflation of the 70s was the result of distributive conflict that was the result of full employment policies of the golden age. And of course, there was a strong impact of external shocks. Okay, so they changed completely the idea. Of course, there are always two approaches, as Professor Gariani always said, but they got it. They won the debate, and they got this idea. And I went back to this how this consensus appeared, because it might be important today when we have another situation that might bring back those ghosts that were they were not necessary, but they were there in the policy kit of tools of policymakers, of central bankers. Okay, so like I say, back to the future, and let's see today. The first, I think I have two questions that are most important. The first one, it's a global process, what's happening today. And the second, there are characteristics or causes of the current inflation, the process. They are common for all the countries. So the two questions, related questions. The first point is that not a global process, and I'll show that it's not something happening in Asia now. If you look inflation I have Japan, ASEAN 5, China and South Korea. Inflation is going down. This is World Economic Outlook data. It's the data for 22 is a forecast, but anyway, that's what I had, and it's IMF data. So it's not going up. In fact, it's going down. So let's say that the big inflation of the of this 22 or after the pandemic. It's a Western phenomenon. I think it's important. It's not like a global process. That's so. Of course, there cannot exploit. Maybe we can discuss afterward, but it has to be. It has some important relation with the how Asian countries cope with the pandemics. But let's just at this point say that it's not a global process. The second point important, I would say that even countries that are facing higher inflation, maybe they don't have the same elements that explain their inflation. For example, I will not explain Brazilian case, for example, who have an accelerated inflation. But in our case, as I guess it's more similar to the European case, we don't have any wage inflation. We have, of course, the oil shock that could have been avoided in Brazil, but it hasn't by policy reasons. We can discuss that. And exchange rate shock that, in my humble opinion, was just a wrong monetary policy adopted by the government in 2000 and 2020. So in the Brazilian case is a particular case when you have a problem monetary policy, too low interest rates, in my opinion. We have like a shock, and we didn't use Petrobras, who is our state-owned oil company, to curb it, or at least to stabilize a bit those prices. So that is a inflation, a shock inflation, or inflation in our case. But let's compare those. So in my presentation, I'll try to compare the European case and the American case. I would like to say that the American case, I have more a literature to base my interpretation. But anyway, I have some data for the European case, and I would love to hear from Antonella if it's mistaken or not, if I'm just saying wrong information. It's not the information, not wrong, but maybe the interpretation. Let's see. So those 5 elements are mentioned in it's mentioned, for example, in an article by the IMF, a recent article in the IMF. Is first of all was supply chain bottlenecks, which is a short-term supply. Okay. How much short-term they are is a debatable point. I just saw still the transportation, the maritime routes, they are in the higher level of number of days. So it's not over yet. It seems like not over yet. And the pandemics, for example, in China, it's not over yet. And so there are factors closed in Shanghai. So it's complicated. Anyway, since there are short-term problems, they should, in a very short term, not a very long period of time, they should end, I guess. So, but they had an impact on 2020 inflation. I think it's clear for me, and the discussion would be how much of this would pass through to wages and then to perpetuate inflation. So that's one thing. The second one is a combination of demand side and supply side. That was a shift in demand toward goods and away from services. And I guess that everybody has this personal experience. When I started the online classes, I bought a new computer, but a web camera. I bought stuff that I didn't even use. I bought the digitalization table that was a new. I didn't use because I could work with this anyway. But I bought a lot of stuff. My family, my son bought a new computer. My wife. So I think that's the change in the working habits. Or my son is a student. It really has a spike. I'll show just this information here. It's from the Economic Policy Institute. We do have a strong spike on the consumption of consumption goods and residential investment in the US. But as you might see, it's falling down. It's very strange that it could be some persistent effect. Everybody starts to buy like crazy, new computers each year. So it's probably a short-term effect. We should not be very concerned with that. In terms of those shortages, there is an interesting paper, and this is the paper here. I just say the first name is Reese, the second name I would not dare to try to read this name, but those guys from BIS, they show that the volatility of commodity price, the only one important element is the rising of shipping costs, that, as I mentioned, they are still at a high level. They are still, the period of travel is too long anyway, but apparently they're going down. Their delivery times are up and the inventories are down. And so there is they are trying to replenish inventories. And so that's the shocks and bottlenecks that are combined with the change in demand that explain the short-term effects. Okay, but it's the short-term effect. There is something that is very important: the supply shocks of energy and food. It was, of course, prior to Russian invasion of Ukraine, but now it's much serious. It's much worse, and something that we cannot, I guess, make any educated guess what is going on, what's going to happen, because it's a very unstable and very confusing situation. So I'll not talk about this, just to show how important it was for the inflation, and particularly, in my opinion, for the case of European inflation. You have also this. So this is kind of the second shift in demand and the supply chain bottlenecks are kind of supply factors. One is demand, but it's not aggregate demand. It's just sectoral demand. I will call the supply shock, and we have the supply shock. Clear, the energy and food. And a fourth element that now is being raised by a lot of people, that the aggregated stimulus that were necessary for the pandemic, to cope with pandemic and the post-pandemic recovery, was too fast, was too strong. And so we have some kind of demand inflation right now. We have these two groups, the ones that are the permanent and in very short term. So there are people that think that this aggregate stimulus were too big, they are too big, and they have a permanent effect. And people that say no, that has to be done at this moment in time, and the effect was not to create an excessive demand or generalized excessive demand. And to me, the most important thing in terms, which combines also demand for labor and supply of labor, that might have an impact on U.S. Nominal wages trajectory. So I think that's a good point to discuss. My very simple, not very sophisticated, very, very simple graphic is to explain to Eurozone oil prices and inflation. To me, it seems like they are quite similar, and seems to me like oil, it's one very, at least, strong element to explain European inflation, Eurozone inflation. So maybe the most important element to explain Eurozone inflation. So in this case, I would consider, and Professor Palumbo, please correct me if I'm wrong, that wage doesn't have that much importance or any importance, or it's not very important, nominal rates. I'll have some data here from the Fed, the Federal Reserve St. Louis, and you see that the rate, of course, you have those outliers, strange outliers in 2020, but the rate of growth of private sector, Eurozone rate of growth for hourly earnings are pretty much constant. It's not increasing. In fact, it's going down. Of course, it's the end of 2021, and I don't have the series for 2022, but they are not going up. At least they are lower. They are lower the rate of growth than the 2000 years. And I have another indicator here. We have hourly earnings of manufacturing for the euro area. It's this it's the rate of growth for the same period of the previous year, and we don't have like an increase. In fact, it's decreasing the rate of growth of hourly earnings. So to me, it seems like what explained inflation in Europe was basically oil shock and gas shock, and wages doesn't have much to do with that. And it seems to me also that our wages would not be able to or at least I'm not saying that would not able to increase after the shock. I'm not saying that because I'm not. But in the US is the case. I think we can discuss more interesting. First of all, this is very famous graph is I call the US Great Divergence, that we see that after 79, exactly what Friedman said that was necessary, the central banks just to do their job. They did their job, and the productivity went up, and you open this enormous gap between the compensation of workers and I put here this most important, non-supervisory workers and workers directly in production or median compensation, and have this enormous gap. So why I'm putting this data here? This is because increase in wages is like historical justice. You just like it's too wide the gap. So if you can close a bit this gap, what not be a problem. But there is a change here. We see that after 2007, this gap is not opening anymore. We have still productivity is increasing above the rate of the average compensation of production of supervisory workers, above median compensation, but the gap is not open anymore. So we have, at least after 2013, an increase of wages that it's keeping up with the growth of productivity. However, important to remember that I started to talk about the golden age. It's not over productivity that it happened in the end of the 60s. So in the terms of distributed conflict, it's not like squeezing profits. It's just following the growth of productivity. So, but anyway, it's following. It's not what was happening before. So another interesting characteristic of the recent period is that the 10th decile, or 10th decile is correct, 20th decile, the first decile, the second decile, it's better to say, they are increasing. If you see it, and then I'll show another data is more clear. With an inclination that is steeper than the growth of the median. So what we have is the 50 to 10 decile ratio is going down. So you have the income distribution in terms of wages is getting better than worse in the US in the last years. So something good that we should not abandon or should not stop because we have crazy monetary policy. That's chasing the monetary after this inflation. Just remember this. So it's not a negative, it's a positive. But anyway, there was this recent paper by Damash and Summers 2022, and what the point? It's funny because Summers was the guy that was responsible for the basic defender of the secular stagnation, and I think that was very important to the Biden program. And after the Biden program, it was the first to shift to no, now it's too much. There is a secular demand. So he's in the both ends. He was the guy that almost was behind the expansionary policy, and now he's against the expansionary policy. It's too much. Anyway, but in this particular case, I think that's interesting to at least discuss his paper, because he used a different specification for the film side. He used the two elements. One is I forgot. One is it's new positions they are created, and the other were people quitting the place they have in the firms. So he combines these two elements to have a firm side equivalent of unemployment rate, and it's very, very low compared to an employee of rate of 3.9. And he said that it's a sign that there's a tight market labor from the perspective of employees, from the demand side. Okay, so he says that it's a problem and it will create, and here is his nominal wages projected, sorry, and it's going up. Of course, in his understanding, there is an inflation, I would say inflation going on, wage inflation going on, but there's a strong risk that wage inflation will become an important element from 2002, from this year to the next 2 years. So that's, so this is very important. There is this a very tight labor market, using his new indicators or his new elements to he lowers. So it's finished almost.
Sorry, Carlos. 2
minutes.
minutes.
2 minutes.
2 minutes left. Thanks.
So this is very interesting, but I didn't. This is the what from the supply side. I think you should discuss this because I think two are important. This immigration restrictions. I don't know if there's this calculus here. Is this how each of these elements reduces the supply of labor or labor force, and I think immigration restrictions due to the pandemics might have some impact on certain services, jobs, and then on the distribution of income. I don't know. I think it's something worth of examining, and of course you have also this reduced incentives to work, and this is very important too. We have something that's not bad; it's good. You have those policies by the government. We have it's the American Rescue Plan, is the credit for children. We have people that saved a lot, so we don't need to rush to any job. We have also the change of people trying to work more at home and not online work. So I think that's an important thing that should be taken into consideration. Anyway, the question is this tight monetary, is this tight labor market sufficient to bring back inflationary expectations that will make it happen again? Could it happen again? I have an interesting information here from EPI that there was, before the 1988, there was this close relationship, a positive relationship between the change in non-labor costs and labor costs. So, but now, from 1989 to 2019, we don't have this relation. So that's the idea of inertia seems to be not very that the workers would incorporate in the wages or the economy in their wages. The shocks, or no labor shocks or commodity shocks, is not something that is proven in recent period of time. So that's what I just finished 1 minute more. The question is that for the future. First of all, is that bad that wages are finally starting to rise? No, I don't think so. So if you have this a correct monetary policy that will break the inflationary expectations, like everybody says, probably will have this very interesting characteristic of them. At least the U.S. economy will end, and then we'll have this the gap will open again. A second, it's possible to fall into another stagflation trap. I don't know. I don't think so. Even the lack of the power of labor and of unions, I don't think that they have the strength to have an answer. And this, I think, this graph is very interesting to have to be able to make up for the losses of the shocks of oil and other commodity shocks. Will central banks follow the conservative consensus that emerged after the end of the golden age? I don't know. Of course, in the US, I really don't know, because US right now, it's in the opposite side of what happened in the 70s. Now you have a new Cold War And maybe it's not a very good idea to have high levels of unemployment and to curb increase of wages. Maybe the geopolitical situation, but probably in Europe, and Europe will have a lot of different consequences. And that's my last point. They will not be uniform. I think here in Europe, it's probably they will follow this recipe and will be very, very bad for countries that already have a very high interest rate that have to finance their public debt, like Italy. So, or Italy, sorry. So maybe the consequences will be different for different countries, different part of the world. Of course, Asia is out of the picture in this case. And so just a guess that the American Central Bank and the American government would not follow the recipe that I mentioned before in the beginning of my presentation due to political or geopolitical elements. But just, I guess, just to throw here and maybe discuss with our friends. And to finish, I like this quote by Friedman: "Only a crisis, actual perceived, produce real change. When that crisis occurs, the actions that are taken depend on the ideas that are lying around. That I believe is our basic function, to develop alternatives to existing policies, to keep them alive and available until the political possible becomes political inevitable." I think that I would like to make the U-turn 360 degrees, is the opposite. He said this about the 70s. I hope that the new policies that will arise after this crisis will be totally opposed for them. We have a crisis, maybe there's an opportunity to change completely economic policies. Okay, thank you very much. Sorry for
thank you, Carlos.
Too long.
Thanks for your interesting presentation, much information and point to discuss well, at the end. Then we'll have the presentation of Professor Kregel. Please, Professor.
Okay, let me see if we can set this up here. Okay. No, this is, okay, this is not doing what it's supposed to do, but there we go. Okay. Okay, if we start, I thank Carlos very much for picking up a lot of hard information and hard data on what we seem to be doing. I want to approach this from a slightly different way. As Carlos mentioned, these are things that we have all seen before, and I'm old enough to have seen this particular movie several times before. So it's sort of interesting to look at the way the thing gets reported. In a number of universities where I have taught, and one of them in particular was Johns Hopkins, and I think Columbia also has a program like this, there was a course, it was a master's course of economics for journalists. And it tried to teach journalists economics so that when they reported, they would in fact provide some sort of reasonable rendition of the economic theories that were behind the economic facts that they were reporting. And it strikes me that in our particular current case of inflation, the journalists are doing a very, very bad job. They're doing a very, very bad job because they tend, as I think increasingly they have been in the last administration and in this one as well, to follow the political lines rather than the economic lines. Now, what do I mean by this? Well, they simply report on inflation, and they report on inflation as if it is, as I say, as if it is a thing. And what I would like to argue is that if you are I would say a good alternative economist, the first thing you know is that inflation is not a thing. It's something that we create. It's an artificially constructed index. It's totally arbitrary. It has no acceptable theory behind it. And what we see is something which is always after the fact, when in fact most prices are determined, if we're interested in prices, are determined by what's going to happen in the future rather than what has gone in the past. It's an endogenous variable. That is, it's something that's the result of dynamic action in the system. And as such, it really can't be directly controlled. And general in a market system, we don't try to control it. So that really it's misrepresents the problems that the economy is facing simply by saying that we have inflation. The standard argument is that inflation has cost so much in terms of workers' pay packets, or that it has caused disruptions in terms of the ability of households in order to meet their current wage and payments. Now, from that particular point of view, I want to go back to the title and to say worrying about inflation is like worrying about the deficit. Okay, in fact, this worry about inflation is just another side of the worry about the deficit. And we also know that the deficit, just like inflation, as I've gone through, is an artificial, arbitrarily constructed index. It has no theoretical basis. It is ex post. It's an endogenous variable, and it cannot be directly controlled by the market system. So why do we worry about it? We have enough discussion in terms of the debate between the deficit doves and the deficit hawks. But I'm trying to start out by saying that really what we should be doing is looking at the interdependence that we have in the system. And inflation is a part of the interdependence, just as the deficit is a part of interdependence in the economic system. So that simply picking out inflation as one particular aspect or one particular policy discussion really misses the point and diverts attention from those things that are really important. Now, the first point that I would like to make is that if we do implicitly worry about inflation, then we are accepting, as Carlos has demonstrated to us, we're accepting Milton Friedman's argument that in fact it is the quantity theory of money and the neoclassical explanation of the existence of money which is behind the idea of inflation. Okay. Now, if we just very quickly go back and look at the way this story is normally told. We start out with individuals who are moving from self-sufficiency to specialization. And the problem is that if you specialize, you have to have somebody who is willing to trade with you in order to keep yourself alive. So if you're the boot maker, you have to deal with the bread maker. So the basic problem that the focus of our basic problem is the idea of exchange of what I say are given endowments. We already know that the boot maker makes boots, the baker makes bread, and the question is, how do we manage to get an equitable exchange? Well, we go through the arguments of the double coincidence of wants. We go through the argument of the coincidence of size. That is, what happens if you want to sell 3 boots rather than 2 boots? Well, there's a problem. You need something that has to intervene. And that intervention is what? Well, the intervention is that somehow or other the market converges on a single commodity, and that way we can reduce all of these bilateral exchange rates to exchange rates relative to the commodity which serves as the money or serves as the center of the value system. Now, this is important. Why? Well, it's important because, as I have written up here, it reduces the number of relative prices you need to calculate in order to optimize the utility of your consumption basket. And basically, this is what prices are supposed to be doing for you. Now, from this particular point of view, if that's our objective, then you would like to have your money commodity or your standard of value to be stable. And it's going to be stable relative to all of the others. Why? Well, it has to be stable so it doesn't disturb all of these relative exchange rates. Okay, so the idea is that this gives you the sort of informational efficiency, and it allows you to Pareto optimize, and you dislike inflation. Why? Well, you dislike inflation because it makes it more difficult for the market system to get to equilibrium. So it's a problem of the efficiency of the market in distributing information, and having a stable standard of value is the thing that is supposed to do that. Okay. Now, that means that instability in the standard of value, which is what? Which is definitely inflation, is a cause of concern. And that's why we are concerned about inflation, is because we have to determine whether the change in prices is due to the money commodity or whether it's due to everything else in the system. Now, if we go back and read Ricardo very carefully, or even if we read Adam Smith very carefully, both of them knew better, okay? Ricardo, when he made his famous proposal for a more secure currency, he said very clearly, I know that it is impossible to have a stable standard of commodity value. And his proposal was then to use gold bullion in terms of a buying and selling agreement with the Bank of England. Okay, now it's sort of interesting that that argument is an argument that Menger also used when he talked about money under the, what was then the Austrian or neoclassical explanation of money. He said the money commodity is going to be that commodity which has the best resale value, has the greater resaleability. What does that mean? Well, it means that if you exchange something for money and you really don't want it because you can't find a double coincidence of wants, that money has to be able to be resold. Okay, this sounds very much like what? It sounds very much like a dealer market. That is, there's a dealer in the market, he buys and sells commodities, and the money commodity will be the one that has the lowest transactions costs in this range. I put up another quotation, comes from a very popular monetary textbook, 1903 in the United States, Lawrence Laughlin. I'm sorry, I've got too many L's in his name. There should be an I up there. No commodity, however, not even gold, has perfect stability of value, since extreme and rapid changes may be produced in the exchange value of the standard. The standard, even of gold, by forces acting solely on commodities, and perhaps not even touching gold itself, it is impossible to maintain unchanged ratios between the standard and goods. The standard question, therefore, is not one relating to the choice between gold and silver. It is a larger question than that. It's the problem granting the inevitable changes in prices as to how justice may best be subserved between debtors and creditors in time contracts. Okay. Now, it's very interesting, the reference to gold and silver, because most of the concerns of economists were in their analysis of bimetallism. That is the change in the relative prices between two potential standards in creating changes in relative prices, and then, as we say, between debtors and creditors. But it's pretty clear here that whether you're using Ricardo or you're using Smith or you're using Laughlin or Irving Fisher, who was a very active participant in this debate over bimetallism, what you're looking at here is a problem between debtors and creditors in terms of time contracts. Okay, and this is something that's very different from the way we look at this fundamental paradigm of exchange, of swapping. We started out with the boots and the bakers. So if we take this particular point of view, the problem is what? Well, inflation is really just the dynamic price mechanism at work. Okay, we should love inflation because inflation is what the market mechanism is supposed to do. Changes in relative prices are the things which in fact do bring about adjustment in the system. And it's not something which is necessarily bad. Now, we know, and from the quotation which I've just made, is that there is always going to be some winners and losers, some debtors and creditors in the process of the natural dynamic evolution of the system. So what I would recommend is that if we want to talk about inflation, there are ways to do this which go away simply from saying, oh, inflation is terrible because it reduces the ability or the quantity of bread that I can buy with my incomes. Marcello Diamand provided a very nice framework for doing this in terms of what he calls the unbalanced productive structure. Okay, unbalanced productive structure says that a normal economy in a dynamic characterization will be subject to bottlenecks. that is the price mechanism, which according to this neoclassical theory is supposed to provide price adjustments without substantial changes in quantities, simply balancing changes. In fact, when there are bottlenecks, will produce adjustments in which you have both quantity and price adjustments. Now, we're currently working with a response to a pandemic. We're working with an international conflagration in Europe, and these look very much like bottlenecks. And if we look at these bottlenecks, what we should be saying, instead of, oh, inflation is awful, it's endemic, we should be saying inflation is doing precisely what we expect it to do. And the cost is what? Well, the cost is really in terms of the balance between price adjustments and quantity adjustments, or between, as Laughlin said, between debtors and creditors, or in terms, if we look at it in terms of particular income categories, that is our wages or our prices adjusting more rapidly. And in the particular current case, at least in the United States, my response is always, if you don't like your 8 or 9% rate of inflation, tell me if you don't like the fact that the unemployment rate is around 3%, because these are saying one and the same thing. So if you want to get rid of inflation, fine, then you're going to get rid of your current employment rate, or sorry, your current unemployment rate, which is historically high. So we can't separate these two. But if you read the newspapers look at inflation, but they never bother to mention that, in fact, wages have gone up, as Carlos has shown, for those areas which are subject to the major adjustment. If you look, there's a very nice website that you can check changes in employment, supply and demand for workers in particular areas. And if you go to the service sector, and in particular go to the service sector for the lowest wage cohorts, you discover that those are the areas in which wages have risen most rapidly, and those are the areas in which employment has started to rise more rapidly. Okay, if you work in a restaurant, or if you work in a fast food, or if you work in the basic service industries, which should have been what we used to call the bad or the dirty jobs industries, those are the ones in which the improvements have been greatest. And we should say, thank goodness that this is happening, because this is a result which is positive. This is not a result which is negative. We can also look at Schumpeter. Schumpeter was very clear when he talks about creative destruction. Creative destruction is what? Well, creative destruction says that there are going to be winners and losers. There will be price inflation in the standard Schumpeterian cycle as the bankers provide the financing for investment. That investment drives up prices. It brings about a retransfer, a redistribution of resources, and eventually it creates conditions in which the new productive activities bring about a response in prices. Again, the dynamic prices. If you read Schumpeter's treatise on money, it's also very interesting, where he talks about the Soviet economy, or a planned economy, as being one which is probably the most equitable. And he uses what he calls his token analysis. Money is what? Money is a token. You contribute to production and you get a token, which says that your token is so many loaves of bread, or it's so many hours of work. Then you take your token and you go to the market and you try to see whether your token is still equal to the same number of hours, or is still equal to the same actual physical pieces of output. And he notes that under capitalism, in fact, because we have wages and we have profits, that there will be a difference between your share in production and your share in consumption. Okay, inflation is simply a change in the denomination of the token when it gets to the use of that token to convert your share of production into a share of consumption. Then finally, if we look at real markets, we always know that in real markets, you're not limited to trade what you have. You're not limited to the amount of boots you produce. You're not limited to your loaves of bread. For most of what we now call financialization, these are markets in which you sell what you don't have and you buy what you don't want. You're speculating on price change. Speculating on price change means that what you're expecting is that there will be inflation in certain areas. Now, as we know, for any financial transaction, a buyer expects prices to rise, a seller expects prices to fall. Okay, everybody cannot be a winner here. So inflation always automatically says that there are winners and there are losers. And what we should be doing is trying to balance or to look at how that dynamic process distributes those gains and losses. But also, if we look at prices in this area, if we look at the inflation rate, we're looking at the wrong price index. The appropriate price index should be the futures market and the way speculation has an impact on prices. As we well know, famines in general don't exist because of a lack of supply. Famines exist because speculators are buying in the expectation of profiting from an increase in prices subsequently. Okay, this is not the kind of real price inflation that the system normally uses. So if we look at it from this point of view and we ask the question, where did the money go? Where's the redistribution? Well, here it is. We can see quite clearly that although people are very hesitant to talk about increasing monopoly concentration and so forth, the wage figures are more or less stable on average. Corporate profits and non-financial corporate profits expanding substantially. That's where the problem lies. But again, when the journalists report the inflation rate, they never report the profit rate. When they look at the loss of purchasing power for workers, they never report at the same time the increase in the purchasing power for corporations or equity holders. Now, the last point which I want to make in terms of how we interpret or trying to put a positive spin on price adjustments, think about inflation accounting. Okay, inflation accounting tries to adjust nominal prices and to produce real terms. Well, there's a different way of looking at inflation accounting. When I worked in the UN, we had a concept which we used in the analysis of the position of developing countries called odious debt. Okay, odious debt basically is a debt that developing countries probably did not contract or did not use for the purposes which were eventually appropriate. And our argument was that it should not be repaid. On the other hand, if we look at the current economic and political environment, we note that there is a large amount of unrequited debt, that is non-recorded debt, non-accounted for debt, which exists. These are negative externalities, and I'm arguing that they could be considered as non-recorded or non-enforceable liabilities or arrears on debt. What are they? Well, if we start, we have the original inhabitants of the land. That land was taken. Okay, this is debt. This is a debt which might or might not be repaid, but it's a debt which was never recognized and never recorded. Politically, many people would now like to recognize that there is a debt. At the same time, at the point of emancipation in the United States, we had a debt, and that debt has never been repaid. There is a movement, a political movement that argues that, in fact, some of that debt should be repaid. Now, in the current environmental conditions, we also have tremendous costs in which we have used the environment, the resources of the environment, without paying for them. As a young graduate student, I was involved in what was then called the Water Project. And the Water Project was an analysis of pollution of the waterways in the United States. And we had this idea of self-preservation of the waterways. That is, there was a certain amount of effluent pollution to the waterways that could be made without denigration of the actual water source. And chemical companies used this at zero cost. That is, it was possible simply to send your discharge into the water as long as the condition in the water did not deteriorate. Well, This was a cost, and this is a cost which we now pay. This is an outstanding debt. Now, just as any Latin American country eventually was forced to repay its foreign borrowing, this debt that we're talking about here is not odious. That is, we don't want to argue that it shouldn't be paid. It should be repaid. And eventually there will be an assessment on how we repay that debt. How is it going to do this? Well, obviously the market will do it through price adjustments, through dynamic price adjustments. So if we look at the costs of environmental restoration as contributing to the inflation rate, we shouldn't think of this as a decrease in purchasing power. We should think of this, as Schumpeter would tell us, as an investment in an innovation which will give us a much higher future return. The difficulty is that all we see is the price in the market. We don't see directly now the return. So again, this is a case in which I would argue that we really should try and recast the rhetoric that we use in terms of looking at inflation. Inflation may be a bad thing if my income is fixed, if I'm on a retirement pension, which I soon will be, I hope, and it reduces my purchasing power. But at the same time, I have to recognize this as a contribution to the restoration of the environment, a contribution to the repayment of debts which have been incurred in the past and cannot be ignored. So this is sort of the take which I would like to give on the current inflation, of trying to couch it within an alternative economic tradition to the one which says, well, the only thing we're worried about is the standard, the stability in the standard of value, and if the stability is lost, then inflation is going to destroy the efficiency of the system. No. Dynamic price adjustment is to allow the system to, in fact, survive over time and to adjust to changes. And we should be reinforcing this particular side of the argument. Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks, Professor. It's brilliant. It was very stimulating. Well, now, Professor Palumbo, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me properly. So, first of all, I have to thank everybody, the organizers for having invited me, and the two speakers, Carlos and Professor Kregel, because they said very, very interesting things, very thought-provoking things that, of course, make my role more difficult, my task much more difficult, because more or less they said some of the things that I wanted to say, and also they gave a perspective, especially Professor Kregel, on the issue of inflation, which is something perhaps we are not very used to. So I will try, first of all, to justify my more perhaps traditional approach, my idea that inflation somehow is a problem, that we should study it, that we should worry about it, even if not in the way mainstream economics worries about it. I try to share my presentation, even if maybe I will not use it very much. But yes, perhaps it is useful. Sorry, just a minute. Can you see that? Yes, thank you. So the question that I try to address is the relationship between theory and the problem of inflation, and especially what heterodox economics may have to say about it. I will give a very simple account of this. The outline of my speech, what I thought was the idea that macroeconomic theory especially the mainstream variety, although obsessed with inflation, maybe has not much to offer in order to understand the phenomenon and to find the true remedies for it. But at the same time, I would like to focus a bit on the main current of heterodox economics to discuss whether there are any interpretative problems there also. And so also to say just a very few words on what are the problems of current inflation. And I think that Carlos already gave us a very interesting panorama of these problems, and so perhaps there is not much to add to his account, and also to the questions that he put at the end of his speech. But maybe first of all, I would like to explain, to say, or at least, as I said, to justify, after Professor Kregel's speech, why one should worry about inflation. I agree with much of what he said, of what he said. I mean, it is true that inflation is perhaps overestimated as a problem in current macroeconomic mainstream, let's say, macroeconomics, and that the obsession with inflation produces policies that are very negative, that risk affecting employment, so that a switch between the two different targets would be very desirable. So I agree with this part of his considerations, and also maybe in part it is true that inflation is a construct, that we do not have a true and reliable measure of inflation that we can be certain about. And I think that this goes back to the very idea of having a general price index that has any that is a problematic magnitude, let's say, and that is a too synthetic measure to give a proper account of what is going on in terms of prices in the economy as a whole. This is something that, as we all know already, Keynes had noted about the unreliability of the general price index. But having said that, the problem is that we also, apart from the obsession of politicians or mainstream economists, we see that inflation is a problem even in the experience of many countries, of many people in many periods. Let's speak about what is happening now, which is a very limited experience, but a current one. It is obvious that, as Carlos was pointing out, that energy prices are the main problem now in Europe, at least in Europe, and that inflation following energy prices, not only maybe oil price, because what we observe also is a certain increase in food prices. So what parts of the society, of the economy, of the population are more affected by this? Of course, there is a problem in the productive activities of many firms in the manufacturing sectors, especially where much energy is used. But if we look at the population at large, of course, the increasing energy and food prices are especially dramatic for the lowest part of the income distribution. Of course, especially for the working class or for people that have lower incomes, this is a real problem that can produce serious. At least I observe what is happening in Italy now, and I'm observing what is happening in terms of increased expenditure in respect to pays, to wages that are not growing at the moment. So the problem of inflation, and Professor Kregel said that much in one part of his speech, is that it redistributes a lot. And when inflation goes above a certain physiological, let's say, amount, this problem cannot be neglected by economic policy. This is my point of view. But the other point of view that I have is that the problem with macroeconomic mainstream macroeconomic theory is that it has no correct understanding of what inflation is, and so no correct remedies for inflation. So let's just very briefly, very quickly explain what is the point that I would like to do. So we all know that inflation is the big problem. This is recognized even since much time. For example, there is Galbraith that devoted an article to the inflation obsession, which I think is very interesting, and especially because it was written in a period in which inflation was not a real problem, and everybody in mainstream economics only worried about inflation targeted, inflation control, and everything else. Monetary policy, since perhaps since monetarism is entirely, and so since the idea of the independence of central bank is entirely devoted to inflation control, at least this is particularly true in some institutional settings, like in Europe. So we can even say that now the monetary theory of inflation, the monetarist, Friedman's theory of inflation, is out of fashion. I think that this is true because nobody is proposing now the control of monetary aggregates. But, and so the dominating model in mainstream literature, but especially in policymaking, is the new Keynesian consensus. But the problem with this consensus is that there is a strong legacy from monetarism and from Friedman, which is the natural rate of unemployment. And this is the main tool which is still used from the point of view of theory, let's say, to understand, to explain the problem of inflation. So we have that at the very bottom of these complex models that we can see in academic literature, and especially in policy-related literature devoted to inflation, inflation dangers, inflation characteristics, inflation control, we see that the idea, the basic idea, is that inflation comes from the labor market. And also we see that related to this, there is the strong idea, when we go to the basics, of course, I'm not discussing the complication of the models. The basic idea is that the only way to check inflation is to check the level of activity, because there is not only the idea that inflation comes from the labor market, but that there is a strong relationship, that it is strictly related to the level of activity and of employment. So the idea is the basic idea of the vertical Phillips curve, of course. The idea that there is a unique rate of employment that is compatible with constant inflation, and that any attempt or any exogenous shock that displaces the economy from such an equilibrium in the labor market is bound to produce inflation if, of course, the the direction is the reduction in the rate of unemployment. Sorry for this mistake, but so this is important to note. Supply shocks in the mainstream account exist, of course. They are within the equation that is used both to define and to estimate the actual rate of inflation, but they are assumed to be temporary. And this goes some way to in the direction of explaining the attitude of mainstream economists and maybe also of central banks in respect to the inflation that has been produced recently by the supply shocks related to the pandemic. So there is something that of course, there is a lot of literature, there is a lot of discussion about the relationship between the rate of unemployment and the rate of inflation and the existence or non-existence of this vertical Phillips curve. A lot of empirical work in which the natural rate of unemployment or its variety, which is the non-accelerating inflation rate of employment is estimated. And the general problem is that it is almost impossible to find a natural rate of unemployment, which is a reliable estimate and at which the economy behaves like theory predicts. Let's just look at one graph, which is one of many that one could show. This is the United States from 2017 to 2020, just before the pandemic. And these are the estimates of the CBO. So these are based on the estimates of the CBO, the blue line especially, which is the unemployment gap. So the idea is just to plot the difference between the actual rate of unemployment and the natural rate of unemployment as estimated by the Congressional Budget Office of the United States. As you can see very easily in this graph, we have at least 3 years in which the natural rate of unemployment was always above the actual rate of unemployment, because we have constantly, since the first quarter of 2017, a negative unemployment gap, which means that actual unemployment was estimated to be below, or at least actual unemployment is measured, and the estimated natural rate of unemployment was above, according to the CBO, the actual rate. And we had no inflation. So the idea that we had no inflation, because as we can observe from this line, the red line, the rate of inflation was fluctuating around the target, the Fed's target, which was 2%. And sometimes it went even below that with the negative output gap. Sometimes it went slightly above that. And it's not only attributable to monetary policy, because it is true that in the first part of this period, we had, let's say, a tight monetary policy, because the Fed repeatedly increased the interest rates on the federal funds. But as you remember, certainly in July of 2019, there was a decrease, a first decrease in the interest rates, and notwithstanding this, the rate of inflation went down instead of exploding. So we have a situation in which apparently we were well beyond full employment, at least in the way it is measured by current official estimates. And the situation was that inflation, there was no inflation. So the problem is that the strong link between activity, employment, and inflation is not there, is not in the data. This is just one example. I could produce hundreds of examples, because you know that everybody knows that mainstream literature has taken pains to find a reliable explanation of the apparent lack of any relationship between unemployment and inflation. What they are looking for is, of course, the short period Phillips curve, the idea that the Phillips curve in the long period is vertical, corresponds to the natural rate of unemployment. The natural rate of unemployment empirically is impossible to identify, but at the same time it is very difficult or almost impossible to identify a reliable relationship, decreasing relationship between unemployment and inflation, even in the short period. We have that this relation changes continuously, that there are periods in which we can almost observe a decreasing Phillips curve, but in the following period we observe an increasing one, an horizontal one, that you change country and the relationship changes considerably. But especially it is not constant, it is not reliable across over different periods in the same country. You can always imagine that the relationship has shifted, but the fact is that in order to be reconciled with observation, this hypothesis should be very frequent, let's say. So we should observe a shift of the Phillips curve almost in any of our observations in order to reconcile facts that we observe with the theoretical idea that there is a strong link between unemployment and inflation. So I'm not saying that there is no link at all, because of course this would be too apparent for the whole macroeconomics of the last 60 years to continue with this Phillips curve myth. So there is some relationship. For example, it is true that in some periods when you observe a strong increase in the unemployment rate in some countries, you also observe that inflation goes down. But this is not a permanent feature. So the relationship appears at times, but also disappears. And what is impossible to find is a regular relationship. So why I am stressing this point? I think that we all know that mainstream macroeconomics has not much to offer to us. But I want to stress this point because I think that also in heterodox economics, sometimes we very easily turn to an idea, maybe sometimes a generic idea, sometimes a more modeled idea that there is indeed a strong relationship between the level of unemployment and inflation. And I'm not sure that we could rely on this, even if we find entirely different theoretical basis for it. So this is one of the things that I wanted to discuss. Now, about the mainstream explanation, there is also the difficulties are not only the basic ones related to the impossibility of finding the theoretical relations in practice. but also with some other phenomena which are related to current characteristics of inflation. So the problem is that it has been assumed that supply shocks could only be temporary. I think there is a theoretical prejudice in these. Supply shocks are not perhaps just temporary shocks. What we are observing that seem a bit more permanent. Carlos already described this very well, so I will not dwell on this. And the other thing, or again, it was mentioned by Carlos, is the fact that if it were true that the bulk of inflation comes from the labor market, and even if we could discuss the US data saying that they actually show a tight labor market, which I doubt actually. Anyway, the problem is that we see in other parts of the world, like Europe, which for many respects is similar to the USA, but we see that inflation is there and we have no appreciable rise in wages. At least, of course, they are rising very little, but below the current rate of inflation. So now the question is, yes, there is also this question that I propose now as a question to the other speakers and as a thing on which to reflect. So if the theory is so wrong, because I think it's so, the theory is wrong, and the tool that they always propose to deal with inflation is monetary policy. So the idea is to increase the interest rate, and this is already done in the States, but it will be done many times during the year, as the Fed has already said, and the European Central Bank will probably follow the Fed sooner or later, even if we do not observe any appreciable increase in wages, because the idea is that after a certain time you have to do something for inflation. So is it true that rising interest rates affect inflation? My idea is that it cannot be that a wrong theory gives rise to a correct policy recipe, let's say. But how do interest rates work? Interest rate increases work actually. So I think it has been already said, or at least hinted at before. I'm not sure, but one effect of monetary policy certainly, again, is distribution. So increases in interest rates tend to affect, at least in over a medium to long period, tend to affect the distribution of income in favor of profits and against wages. So there are many authors that have described the policy of the European Central Bank, which have been consistently restrictive until 2011, as policies that were meant as a way to check for the growth in wages, that had a precise objective, a precise target in terms of the distribution of income, that directly or indirectly managed to control the growth in wages. So in a way, it is true that interest rates increases, at least in a very indirect way, operate against a certain type of inflation, in the sense that they check, even if not in with let's say with the mechanism that the mainstream account says, they actually manage somehow to check the growth in wages. So the problem is, of course, we could say that to check inflation we could increase the interest rates, but we have to know that this would mean to operate against wages, and as Carlos has shown very well, and also it is obvious that wages have been so damaged in the last 40 years by all kinds of phenomena that happened, both policy and actual phenomena in the economy, that of course there is absolutely no need to compress wages still more. So the problem with heterodox economics now, what is to try to understand all these relations in a different way, and to especially produce a theory of inflation which is both convincing, useful, realistic, and gives us some way to check inflation in case we believe that inflation is a problem, which I do, which I think that we should. So I try to be quick because I think I am afraid that I lost too much time, but I want just to say a couple of things about heterodox models of inflation.
Sorry, Antonella, we have 1 minute left.
Okay. So I will say that very quickly. I think that we should be aware of not relying too much on the Phillips curve, even of the traditional type. I see in many models, in many heterodox models, the idea that it is sufficient to abandon the vertical Phillips curve in order to produce an heterodox account of the inflation problem. I believe that empirical evidence tells us that there is no such strong relationship between unemployment and inflation, even in the past. It is sufficient to go back to the literature on the Phillips curve of the 60s to see that there is no such strong evidence in favor of the existence of a stable, reliable Phillips curve, even before the monetarist Phillips curve was invented. And also, I believe that conflict inflation is a very interesting point of departure, because it rightly gives importance to the role of institutions and social forces, but again, it may be a mechanical way of dealing with the inflation problem in case heterodox models produce strange results, like a unique Janeiro, for example. So in the end, I think, first of all, that also international relationships and so international causes of inflation should be modeled in terms of conflict inflation, which is not only a conflict between wages and profits, or at least not only a conflict between domestic wages and domestic profits, and also that the true thing about inflation is that there is a plurality of causes, and that we are not able to study inflation with any simple model and to produce useful recipes for that. So I leave the questions, the last slides for later, if there is time in the discussion. Sorry for being too long.
Thank you very much for your interesting presentation. Many things to discuss and not much time. I don't know if Jan and Carlos want to say something because to respond Antonella question, or shall I read the question on the chat? I don't know. What do you prefer? First the questions, or okay?
No, we should read. I guess we should answer the questions that are on the chat.
Okay.
I'm trying to read the chat here.
Well, let's go. Just Powell cast doubts about Carlos' idea of inflation is a Western problem. He said the Thai data are that inflation for this 2020. Sorry, I can. It's now
That
at
the Thai is a higher. Okay.
high level since the pre-2008 spike, and it's forecast to soon be at its highest level.
I didn't. Yeah. I just look at aggregated data, so I got Asian 5, and as I said, the problem is that I got the World Economic Outlook. So for 2022, they have just estimates. So probably sorry, Jeff, I don't know the Thai case. So that's
thank you,
Jeff. A correct criticism.
But Roy said, what are the tools available to address inflation that are suggested by this alternative perspective in opposition to conventional solution? For example, raising interest rates. Rafael Pahim, I would like to use the Roy William Covey question to extend to the peripheral economies. What are the tools to address the inflation in those economies? And two more. Is inflation positive in a tight labor market with wages rising faster than prices, and negative in the case of real wages losses? When we face cost shocks or profit inflation, when does inflation becomes a real problem in a heterodox progressive point of view? The last, and then we'll continue if we have time. Question to Professor Kregel. First, thank you for the very interesting and thought-provoking presentation. Your essential argument is that inflation is redistributional through market prices adjustments. If it is correct, please address instability caused by inflation. For example, price stability diminish product investment due to increased uncertainty regarding potential revenues and costs. The most obvious manifestation is hyperinflation, where the trust in the economic system collapses. Well, then if we have more time. No more question. Great. Well, I don't know. Maybe Professor Kregel.
Okay.
Do you want to start?
If we go back to the first one you mentioned, and then we'll try and work through. If you remember the old theory of welfare economics, and I hope people don't teach this anymore, but I certainly was taught it. And one of my professors was an active contributor, Nicholas Calder. So we have these arguments about the possibility of offsetting costs and benefits by making welfare changes. So you start out with this idea is that you make the change if it manages to benefit somebody and doesn't make anybody else worse off. And then Nikki came up with this very neat idea, said, well, you should really make this change even if you don't compensate people who are made worse off, as long as you could be able to compensate them for being worse off. Okay, so there is in the literature a recognition that there are always gains and losses when you have these sorts of changes. Now, the question is, really, do we want to use compensation to the price mechanism to do that? And this basically, Nikki was an expert at using taxes in order to fiddle the price mechanism so that you could have compensation across winners and losers when you had changes in policy. What I would rather suggest is that if you take an alternative approach, and this is the one that Hyman Minsky has always supported, he said, if in fact what you're doing is simply trying to maximize the growth rate of the economy over time, maybe an alternative would be to try and maximize the employment rate over time. If your objective is employment, then what happens? Well, basically, if you are guaranteed, and this is where his employer of last resort program came in, if you're guaranteed employment, then at least what you've done is you've put a floor under the loss that you would suffer if there is a decision to, as Antonella has said, if there's a decision to fight inflation by introducing austerity, because the standard argument is always that what we're going to do is to fight inflation by using some sort of policy to reduce activity. But if instead your objective is employment, then by definition, the loss that you would normally get, and this is the problem of balancing gains and losses. You see, normally we think of balancing gains and losses to the extent that inflation causes me to lose a half of a loaf of bread because the price of bread went up and my salary didn't. But the real problem is my job disappeared as a result of inflation because we're fighting inflation. So the counterbalance that we want to do is to say, well, if we're having a policy in order to redistribute those gains, or sorry, redistribute those losses, then what we would like to do is to make sure everybody has a minimum. And that minimum comes in terms of some sort of employer of last resort program. Now, obviously, as I mentioned at the beginning, all of this feeds back into the question of what the role of the deficit is going to be. But if you look at most of the employer of last resort studies, we discover that in fact they have virtually no impact on inflation, and the size of the financing for the program usually doesn't exceed around 1% of 1% of GNP. So this is the first way that I would respond to this. As I said, instead of trying to intervene directly. Okay. Now, the other problem here is to pick up Antonella's question at the end: what impact does the interest rate have on activity? In the United States, it used to be very clear. The interest rate went up, the mortgage rate went up, the mortgage rate went up, residential housing went down, construction employment went down, and you then had a very direct impact on prices. So if you go back to the 1950s and the 1960s, you have a very clear causal chain that runs from monetary policy through the mortgage rate to residential construction and employment, and then it runs through to prices. Unfortunately, that doesn't exist anymore. It doesn't exist anymore because obviously we have different ways of doing residential housing. We have different financial innovations which allow the mortgage rate to be used in a very different way. So that clearly doesn't occur. So if I had to answer that question, I would say basically the interest rate has no impact at all on the level of activity, one way or the other. And the answer to that is why? Well, as I said before, most prices are currently expectational prices, they're futures prices. What's driving the inflation rate are the futures prices, not the current prices. If you go back to the period before 2006, we had a tremendous boom in housing prices, but we also had a tremendous boom in commodity prices. And that boom in commodity prices was due precisely to the creation of futures funds, which allowed individuals to invest in physical commodities, which drove up the demand for physical commodities far in excess of the real use for those commodities. So clearly there was this break between what was happening in the real sector and what prices should have been in order to give equilibrium, and the prices that were generated by the fact that we were generating large financial flows into these activities. Now, you went into these activities, why? Well, one of the reasons was that interest rates were excessively low and people were worried about inflation. These things were sold as inflation hedges. If you went to your banker said, well, you can protect yourself from inflation by buying my commodity fund, because my commodity fund will increase in value when the price of food goes up. So if it costs you more to buy food in the market, you can simply compensate by the fact that you have these capital gains on your investments in commodities. Okay, so these are the sorts of things that you don't want to do. Okay, those are compensations for inflation that make the problem worse rather than making it better. Now, just very quickly, let's go to the last question. This is the same problem. The question is, if you're looking at redistribution is fine, okay, if the objective is chosen appropriately. So what I did at the end was to say we have all sorts of objectives that redistribution might be used for. That is, if we want to pay compensation to original inhabitants, if we want to pay compensation to emancipated slave families, if we want to pay compensation to the environment, which means investment in the environment, okay, these are things that we should support. And these are things that normally we need some sort of political activity to support. Now, the difficulty is that in the current environment, we're unable in the United States to pass legislation to resolve environmental degradation because of inflation. So in fact, we're going to increase the amount of drilling of carbon-based energy in order to fight inflation. Okay, now that's something that you want to avoid. Okay, so now if this is the argument, if this is the impact of the redistribution, we say no, this is not what we want to support. On the other hand, we should support the alternative, and the way of doing this, and this is why, you sort of go back to this, the idea of how these things are presented in the press. Okay, if continuously inflation is sold as stealing from low-wage incomes, then you're going to have a problem when you get to the Congress, because nobody in Congress is going to be willing to vote to increase prices in order to pass a bill which takes into account some sort of recognition of the costs of environmental resolution. I think I'll stop there.
Thank you.
Antonella,
Carlos?
okay,
Antonella?
yes. It's okay, Antonella, if you want to answer a question.
I think that you had more questions than me, so if you want...
I'll try to be really quick. Okay. So there is just 3 questions. The first, Rafael Paim asked about peripheral economies, and something I can talk about it a little bit. And that's funny because in peripheral economies, at least in Brazilian case, the interest rate really works, but through a different channel. It's through an exchange rate channel. So we increase interest rates, and then there was a exchange rate evaluation, and so imported price go down, and even export price go down also because they are tradable. So we have a positive effect of raising, of course, not raising whatever level, but to raise interest rates and not going through demand for cutting demand, but through exchange rate. So, but it is just what has been done here in Brazil for a long time, is to raise interest rates. So you have the exchange rate goes down, prices of commodities and imported goods go down, and you control inflation. Basically, you use interest rate to control exchange rate. But I guess if I have to suggest something that would be more, or because you have like the problems, the distributive problems that Antonella mentioned, and you can have even a demand problem in Brazil. We are so used to very high interest rates that it's not something affect too much the level of activity. In fact, it's the fiscal policy much more, of course, everywhere fiscal policy is much more important, but Brazil particularly is much more important than interest rates. And to have the basic interest rates and to have a huge spread. So the effect is complicated. It's not very easy in Brazil to understand the base interest rate. They are related to exchange rate and the level of activity. So the channel is completely different. It's exchange rate, interest rates, exchange rate, and price. So that's what. But what I have been working in this peripheral economies and inflation for a long time. And I think one important thing is to stabilize the exchange rate, because the main sources of inflation and peripheral countries are exchange rate shocks. So if you have an external balance or situation, a situation more stable, or don't have a huge current account deficit, you have a better export pattern. Probably it's one of the most important elements to control inflation in peripheral economies. However, there is a question by Roy Williams, the suggestion of alternative perspectives. And it's a complicated question, because as I mentioned, my first slide was the inflation is a symptom of class conflict. And as Antonella mentioned, is also a conflict between countries. So you have sometimes you have like we call here, I don't know its general name, the natural resource policies. It's not like populist policies. Countries have the right to increase their profits when they control one specific natural resource. That was the case of oil in the 70s. So we have to add to this problem of class conflict or wages and profits, also a conflict between countries trying to bid up the prices of the natural resources. It's important to take into consideration this. Yes, it's happening today. We see that. So of course, as I mentioned, we manage. We understand how to manage demand, but to control inflation is complicated because it's intrinsic to capitalist economy. So that's not very simple. And inflation, I think it can be self-defeating. My departing point was exactly the 70s, because I'm sure that the high inflation with the stagflation of the 70s was a very important element to weaken the power of labor. And then open the doors to the conservative wave that began in the 80s. So I think it's a real serious problem, and it happened in Brazil too. In Brazil was a different question, is because the 80s crisis, nothing to do with the 70s, was the end of international financial flows to Brazil, and we have a decade of very high inflation. It has a very strong influence on the population. And after, if you say we will end inflation, okay, so the neoliberal order in Brazil almost starts with the end of the inflation, what that was caused by different causes. It was the external debt crisis. Anyway, but there are serious political consequences, and that's the contradictory thing that Antonella was mentioned. If you want to have a higher rate of employment, of course, there's no Nauru, I agree 100% to show it that there's no mechanical relationship, but there is a relationship, a political relationship. It depends on the strength of labor movement, political, and it's complicated. So just 1 minute, I wrote a paper on the Scandinavian model, and in this period of time, they could keep a very low rate of inflation. First, because the commodities were stable and low during the golden age. And second, the exchange rate was given and was fixed. And third, the interest rate was low. So even in this situation where all the cost elements were kind of kept in the very low level without a lot of variation, even in this case, the concern of Scandinavian policymakers were to not allow the wages to go too fast in order to squeeze profits of the export sector. That was the main issue for them. So it's no easy answer. It's complicated. I think it's intrinsic to capitalist economy. It's intrinsic to the world that had interests and a different distribution of natural resources. And I think it depends on each country. As I mentioned, in Brazil, if you raise interest rates, you have a positive effect on inflation, given a totally different channel of transmission. Is the exchange rate channel of transmission. This is another thing. It's nothing to do with demand. But of course, you have tried to make some arrangement or a political arrangement that the workers would tolerate less increase of inflation when they have a shock. But anyway, is a kind of a political agenda or a political agreement that's complicated. It's power. So the technical answer is not simple because there's a lot of political struggle that is mixed up on this just economic mechanical measures. So it's not easy.
So I think it's my turn, no?
Yes, please, Professor. We have not much time, but
okay.
please.
I try to be very quick, also because I did not receive many direct questions, but there are things that, as Carlos was saying now, I think that I give the classical answer of a professor in the moment that a brilliant student poses a very difficult question. And we say, well, it's complicated, just because we have to gain time and to. But the truth is that, as I was trying to say, is that even as heterodox economists, we do not have so many clues, so many tools, so many clues to understanding correctly the problem of inflation, at least not general explanations, and also this implies that we have no many tools. But I think that we should very seriously consider the problem of controls. There is some interest now in the literature. For example, there has been Isabella Weber on the Guardian, but some debate on the idea that since this is an inflation which we were not used to anymore, that it comes from specific disruptions, from specific supply shocks or supply problems, we should be able to address these problems directly. But I believe that economies, at least, for example, European economies, destroyed their ability to rule the economy so finely as it should be needed in order to implement this kind of policies. I think that macro policy is much easier, but also is much less useful in these cases. So one problem is that I think we should be careful about the idea of controls, because you could induce worse problems that you try to address, but we should also build competencies in order to be able to go precisely in the sectors to see who is gaining too much from inflation and where you could extract some of the rents that the situation is producing. Another thing is about speculation. I think that Jan Kregel was pointing out that futures prices are possibly much more important than are very important in some markets like energy. And I think that we should again go back to Kaldor, who recognized that there are some markets in which the price is not regulated by the flows of production, demand and production, but they are regulated by stocks, and so speculative stocks especially. And I think that commodity and energy are of this kind. And so we should study this form of price formation, which is different from the let's say the classical approach, no? And yes, so tools. It is. I think that inflation somehow has to be fought, not with austerity. I think I tried to be clear on this, and it is absolutely, I absolutely agree with Jan Kregel when he says that employment is much more important to protect, but at the same time, you have also to protect the wages of the employed from inflation. And this usually means producing more inflation. There is something very, very paradoxical in the last, let's say, 30 years after the wave of the 70s. In the periods of inflation, we had wage losses. And in periods of deflation, we had wage losses. So the problem is that there is inflation is neither bad nor good. It's something that should be regulated by policy, should be addressed by policy, and should be fought when necessary with the right tools. And we still have to think hard about this.
Thank you, Professor. Well, it's interesting the topic and your presentation, but we have to finish. I hope we'll meet again. Thank you, Professor Kregel, Carlos Pinkusfeld, and Antonella Palumbo for accepting the invitation, and thanks participants to be here. Well, Danielle, I don't know if you want to add something.
No, thank you. It was very interesting. We have the recording that we're going to upload on the website later, which is the link, and now it's on the chat, the association's website. And just a final announcement before we wrap up. So we have our annual conference coming up on the 6th, 7th, and 8th of July. And the call for papers sadly is closed, but we will open the registration soon for participants, for those that want to attend the sessions. So we will be posting the news on the website very soon as well.
Well, thank you, everyone. We'll finish here. I'll stop the record.